Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I've got a very special guest with us today who is Robert Childs. He's here to talk about a book that he's been working on and also other things about rapier fencing, HEMA, his experiences, and I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of interesting material here. So first of all, thank you for coming onto the channel, Robert. Or can I call you Rob?
Me.
Can I call you Rob?
By all means, Rob works just fine.
So thanks a lot for joining us. And first of all, why don't you tell us about who you are, what you do, and your book?
Okay, well, my name's Rob Childs. I've been fencing for more than 34 years now. Got started at the tender age of 17, at least officially anyways, with official lessons. I'm a military officer in the United States Air Force, and my particular forte, if you will, no pun intended, is the rapier with terms of combat. I love rapier and dagger in particular, and I have learned quite a bit in my time, and the book comes as a result of that knowledge that I've been able to acquire from fencing against people all over the world and all over the US. So yeah, that's what Revelations of Rapier is about, is that experience, that learning, that knowledge that I have come across, and I just wanted to share it with folks who might find it of use.
Great, yeah. So I've been looking through that book, and it's a very interesting take on a HEMA weapon, I think, because you've clearly got extensive Olympic fencing background before moving into HEMA, and so I think that shows somewhat in the arrangement of the book. You've come at it from almost books that I've studied that have looked at modern fencing. You've approached it from, in some ways, from that perspective, I think. And so I think a lot of people who are maybe starting out in fencing of any kind, and this book I think can be applied to numerous weapons, not just rapier, although it uses the rapier as the tool. I think a lot of people would find this a really, really interesting book to introduce themselves. Actually, I think whether they're an experienced practitioner or whether they're new into it, I think it's very palatable and consumable. I found it very, very well structured, and even just quickly going through it, it was very easy to see that it has a very strict formula to how you'd set it out, and also deals with certain topics that a lot of typical HEMA books wouldn't necessarily look at, like your own take of a certain type of buckler that we might mention later on, and multiple opponents, and training with disabilities or with age, kind of considerations and stuff like this. So really interesting structure to the book.
Well, thank you very much. I tried to make it as understandable as possible, because if there's one thing I've definitely learned over time, is that trying to write everything you know about fencing in the written word alone, it is so difficult. But I tried to make it as understandable to someone who is not a student of mine or somebody who was picking it up for the first time. I wanted it to be as understandable as possible, and I hope I was able to make that come across.
Yeah. And so just for viewers who don't know who you are, and I think a lot of people in HEMA will know who you are, but for anyone who's watching who doesn't know who you are, you have forged quite a name for yourself in HEMA on the competitive scene, particularly with rapier, although I know that you have also competed with saber, single stick, and nylon longsword, I see from HEMA ratings as well.
Yes,
so
indeed.
And both single rapier and dagger, which are different classifications on the ratings. So what kind of drove you towards the, should we say, the competitive side of HEMA?
So when it comes to that, like you read in the book there, I got my start in Olympic fencing, and that's because at that time it was all that was available to me. I knew that I wanted to learn fencing. I just didn't have an avenue until I just happened to discover somebody who was actually teaching. So I became a student, started doing Olympic fencing, had a great time with that. It taught me a great deal about timing, tempo of attacks, speed, how to utilize so many different aspects that we already have innately within us, and also to train in still others. But it still, for me, it fell a bit short still, because I wanted something more martial. I wanted something that was going to teach me to be a swordsman, right? And so that's why I ultimately, as soon as I had the opportunity, transitioned over into rapier. It was obviously the weapon itself is heavier. It had a bit more of a realistic application to it. Obviously, there's a certain amount that we can't be as 100% realistic, because let's face it, we don't want to actually kill our friends. But but I transitioned into that because of that desire for a martial combat, to be as much of a swordsman as I possibly could without the sporting aspect of it. I went into competition in particular because you are never going to have a better gauge of whether or not something works or does not work than when you have somebody who's trying to stop you from doing what you are trying to do to them. And through that laboratory, if you will, of competition, I've been able to discover things about sword combat that I know that I would not have been able to discover if not for the fact that I had somebody out there who was completely different style, or this person who was a completely different body type or different reflexes. It gives me a really good laboratory of what works and what doesn't work, and allows me to refine my own personal take on the art of rapier to what it is today.
And how did you personally get introduced to or start HEMA or historical fencing or rapier specifically? How did you make that leap from sort of modern Olympic to historical?
So there actually was an interim group before I ended up getting into HEMA, and that was for the longest time I was meeting with this group for Olympic fencing practice, and I was there every single Tuesday. And then I started to notice that I would do that for the first 2 hours, and then the next 2 hours this other group would come in, and they were fencing with rapiers. And immediately my interest was piqued. So for a very long time, I then started 2 hours of fencing with Olympic fencing, and then the latter 2 hours was with the SCA. And this was an SCA rapier group. So I started fencing against those folks, started discovering some different aspects of that and the differences between the two. And one was, for me, one was more satisfying than the other. And in that, I'm talking about rapier combat. So I started fencing against the SCA folks. I started going to their events and competing in their tournaments. And I learned very quickly, given where I was there in Washington State at the time, and then later on in California, I mean, there were just so many tournaments that I could go to in order to refine what I was doing. So, I mean, if there's one thing the SCA has been very good for, it's been providing me bodies. So I went through that. And then from that, HEMA started making its appearance more known, readily available. And then I started transitioning, again, still fencing against the folks in the SCA, but going into the HEMA aspect of things, because it was a new avenue, more people, and a diversification of styles that was even greater than I had before. So yeah, how could I not go into the HEMA aspect?
Was that, this is, I guess, quite a personal question for me, actually, did you find it interesting moving from the SCA rapier environment, which we've never really had in Europe? Well, we do have it, but it's tiny. And I personally don't know any SCA rapier fencers, despite the fact I know they exist. The SCA is not very big in Europe. Did you find it interesting, challenging, whatever, kind of moving from that into HEMA, where people were trying to do specific styles? Because I think there's a change there, isn't there? Yeah.
Well, when it comes to people wanting to do specific styles, the SCA at the time, especially when I had first, started competing against them, they very much had their folks that I would call the purist aspect, right? The ones that were trying to recreate as best they could the style that they chose, that they wanted to emulate. And they were everything, Fabra, Saviolo, Capoferro, insert period master here. They were wanting to create that, and they were practicing that as best they could from the texts and whatnot. And on the HEMA side of the house, they're doing the same thing. There's a great many people that have their chosen style that they want to, master as best they can. So that much actually was not different between SCA and HEMA. What was different between SCA and HEMA was what I was allowed to do. In terms of speed, movement, the moves that I was allowed in and of itself. For example, when competing in an SCA aspect, they're very much, and I know it's not very big in Europe, but across the US, they're all over the place.
Yeah.
I'm only really capable of moving at about 75% of the speed that I'm capable of at its most, at the greatest. And the moves that I'm allowed to use is 65% of what you're allowed to do, because the SCA doesn't want you, for example, to place your hand on the person When it comes to the speed, they want you to hit with the lightest touch possible, and
Ah,
that means if I was to move at my fastest, which increase speed, increase force, they don't want that. So there are some
ah,
target areas that I kind of have to let go, because if I was to, it requires a greater speed to hit it, and if you do hit your opponent, then there's
mm,
that aspect of not lightest touch anymore. On the HEMA side of the house, I mean, although we don't want to hurt our opponents, obviously, but because of the fact that we've got much greater robust masks that are being used on the HEMA side than on the SCA side, we've got greater protection in terms of the plastrons and the jackets that we use. I can move much faster, and I'm allowed to do much more of what I actually know on the HEMA competition as opposed to on the SCA side. SCA, you're not allowed to do those cutting that we like to do in HEMA. So it's just SCA has got some very good fencers and skilled fencers, but I'm allowed to do more on the HEMA side of the house.
I wasn't aware of that at all, as I say, because I've had so little exposure to SCA. So I didn't. That's a very interesting definition between them. Yeah, very interesting stuff. So rapiers. Why? What is it about rapiers that fascinates you?
Literally for as long as I can remember, I have been just drawn to sword fighting in general, fencing in general. And the rapier in particular, for me, there's just rapier and dagger is my absolute favorite form to fence. And that's because I've got a weapon in each hand that move independently, but they work in concert with each other to form the basis behind all of the defenses and the offenses that you present to your opponent. To me, it just allows for there's such freedom and imagination and allowance for creativity when I've got these two weapons working together. It's just, I don't know, it's just something that I've never experienced with any other weapons form. Single rapier is a lot of fun, have a great time with it, but man, you put that dagger in my hand, on my offhand, and I'm just a smiling guy. So it's a good time. I'm a very big fan of imagination and creativity, and it just allows for so much of it to have a weapon in either hand.
Is there any historical or period relationship with, did you love musketeers or buccaneers? Was there anything particular about the rapier's period or look or anything else that appealed to you?
No, there was nothing in terms of like movie wise as a kid. I mean, obviously as a kid I loved sword fighting movies, absolutely. I was but I don't know, it's just something about the rapier. As soon as a sword touched my hand for the first time, it felt like it had been there 1,000 times before. And then as soon as I put, a dagger in my offhand, I don't know, it just something clicked, like it was, this is the way it's supposed to be, and so I just kind of ran with it, and have been going with it ever since. I absolutely love sword and dagger. I'd love doing longsword as well, as, like I said, I've competed in longsword and saber and single stick. I've got medals in all of those, but rapier is just, it is just something about it. It just so much about it just feels right, feels normal.
It's funny, isn't it? Sometimes you just gel with something. And for me, for many years, I focused on longsword and medieval systems, but I dabbled in saber on the side, and I just have always gelled better with saber. It just works better for me as an individual. And also single sword systems work better for me. One-handed sword and single swords. I would love to be competent at, sword and buckler or rapier and dagger, but as soon as I've got something in my left hand, it massively diminishes my abilities with my right hand. So I literally, if I'm forced to fence sword and buckler, sometimes I'm literally better off just holding the buckler there and just fencing single sword.
I've never been to the UK yet, but it is my plan to one day get out there, and I will be more than happy to give you some sword and dagger tips if you want.
When I get out there. I'm just starting to dabble in it a little bit now. So despite the fact I've been doing HEMA for a couple of decades, I've never really paid much attention to rapier, and particularly rapier and dagger, but I'm literally just starting to play with it a little bit now. So your book will be very, very useful in that, actually, and I do intend to use it. So another question I had was, do you stick to one particular type of rapier? So viewers of my channel will be aware that there's a wide variety of rapiers. They come in different lengths and shapes and hilt types and geographic tendencies and everything else. Do you stick to one particular type of rapier, whether you're competing or just fencing, in your own club? And if you use different type of rapier, if you do you modify how you use it?
So, very good question. I have used the same rapier since I first started rapier, the exact same one over the last, few decades that I have been fencing now. So it's got quite a bit of history with me, anyways, But it's I use a twisted swept hilt, which is this version here. This is a replica of it. Mine is actually elsewhere, but it doesn't have the straight keons that you'll see on a lot of other rapiers, and keons can definitely be of use, but I have found that everything that I can do with a rapier that has keons, I'm still capable of doing with my own particular preference of rapier, which is just, it's got the curved keon here, and that's it. That's all it's got on terms of keons. But depending upon how you use it, you can still do all of the exact same type of moves. I'm a very big strength and binding maneuvers kind of guy. I like to attack my opponent's weapon before I attack them to ensure that I have control of what they are doing. And I have not noticed that there is any difference between, like, for example, Pappenheimer that has a lot of great hand protection. As a swept hilt, of course, has got some openings that someone could thrust through there. But again, it's about how you use it. And I have found really no problem whatsoever defending my hand inside of that swept hilt. It's just a matter, have I incorporated and taken into account that? Absolutely. When I move, my hand is moving a certain way, my wrist turns a certain way, absolutely. But as far as the actual rapiers themselves, hey, whatever works for a person is what I actually encourage them. I've got students of my own that prefer Pappenheimers that prefer the clamshell. Some of them have got that, what I call the salad bowl, which is more the later rapier that we have seen, just because it protects the hand like it does, and they don't want to have to worry about defending against the thrust. But I like the pretty. I will say that right now. I like the twisted swept hilt. So I find it very useful.
I find that really, really interesting, actually, because I have observed, certainly in the UK, and I will say some of Europe, there is a tendency for people to use cup hilts when the cup hilt doesn't necessarily relate to their system, style, or anything at all, and I've been a little bit critical of this. In one hand, I've got a cup hilt myself now, but there's no question, I think, for an average fencer, the cup hilt provides more hand protection, and so therefore that's one less thing to think about. And
I've had plenty of opponents that will attest that if you present your hand to me, I will take it from you. I will absolutely zip in there and hit you in the hand, or in the case of the folks that like to use a cup hilt, I will go up and hit just slightly above the wrist. If you're not defending it properly, it's going to get struck. But and like I said, I've got my own students that will use that precisely because they don't want to have to worry about defending those fingers, defending the back of the hand, or for that matter, if they're holding it correctly, it will also defend, the wrist. So I don't hold that against them, but yeah, if you're practicing a specific style and that used a specific rapier, I'm kind of yes and no about it, because I'm the first person that will tell somebody to incorporate what works for them, what feels natural to them, what makes sense to them, in order to become their best swordsman. So that way, because I truly do believe that there is no way that you can take, let's say you're a fan of Capoferro, and that's the style that you want to practice and master. But there's no way you're going to be able to do it, particularly since that master is, 400 years dead, that you're going to be able to do that in the way that he did it. Even if he was alive today, you are who you are. You have your strengths, your weaknesses, you have your reflexes, and Capoferro, would have his. So it's important, at least for me, from my perspective, that as a teacher, that I am teaching my students how to become their best swordsman, not the best imitator of me. I have got to teach them to capitalize on their strengths and to truly become their best. That's really the only way I can see for my input to be able to help them get there.
Okay, that's really, really interesting, and I personally think it's great that you're using a swept hilt rapier because a lot of competitive rapierists are not, and I think it's great to see swept hilts being represented, and also statistically they were the most common style of rapier hilt that were around for 100 years. So I think
And I do like the style of them, just because
Yeah.
they're very stylish. I like them. So.
Yeah. So related to some of what you've just said,
Mhm.
there are obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, incidentally, I'm not going to assume knowledge for people who are watching this video, there are a massive range of documented rapier systems. We're very lucky to have a whole bunch of treatises from the 16th and 17th centuries talking about the use of the rapier from Spain, Italy, France, England, Germany, and so on. And they've all got varying stances, different styles of gripping the sword, which you talk about in your book, different guard positions, different use of balance. Some of them are back weighted, some of them are forwards weighted, which again you talk about in your book. Different emphasis on cuts and thrusts, different styles of even cutting. So as I mentioned, you mentioned this in your book, and you accommodate for that, and I think you emphasize trying to bring out the best characteristics in the person you're training, regardless of their particular style that they might be trying to follow.
Right.
But how do you view these historical variations in these systems personally in application to your personal system and how you fence? Right. And do you dislike or disregard any particular techniques or advice or even fencing positions in any of these period treatises?
Yes, there definitely are some things that I disagree with about. I view the various fencing styles that are available out there, regardless of whatever it is that a particular fencer's preference. There are some things that are definitely, in my view and in my experience, that are definitely right, and there are some things that definitely could be improved upon. So when it comes to my particular exercise of my art, I am so strongly an advocate for balance, the perfect balance. And I'm talking about not just in the way that you're standing, but the balance of everything that you do. But in particular, since you had asked, like, for example, stances, there are, as we all know, there are styles of fence that ask you to lean forward, or they exercise leaning backward. But when you do that, and this is, again, based upon my own experience, so anybody who's, I'm not trying to offend anybody's sensibilities out there, but I have found that because rapier combat is measured in literal fractions of a second, everything that you do that slows you down by a fraction of a second, if you're slowing yourself down by a little on the movement, and you're slowing yourself down in the way that you thrust, and you slow yourself down in the way that you are recovering. There's all of these techniques that if you're not doing them to the optimal, then you are cutting yourself off by these fractions of a second. Well, you start adding all of those fractions up, and that adds up to a lot of time. And when you're talking about literal fractions of a second, it takes to, just as an example, when I lunge and I attack my opponent, and I swear to God, I'm not trying to brag here, but if you blink at the moment that I make my attack, I will be in and out before you finish that blink, because of the fact, not because I've got Superman reflexes, but it's because of the way that I move. It is the absolute minimal needed to get an accomplished goal done. And if you blink at that moment, you have missed it. But if you're fencing in such a way that slows you down like that, it's going to look like I am moving 2 and sometimes 3 times faster than you are, when I'm not. I'm just moving in a way that is capitalizing on all of the time that is available. If, as an example, you are fencing in a style that asks you to put the majority of your weight, or even a greater percentage of your weight on the back leg, well, when the time comes for you to retreat away from me, I'm going to be paying attention to this when we fence. And when I make my attacks, I'm going to know that you cannot retreat from me as fast as you normally would than if you had an equal distribution of your weight and all of that potential energy stored in the bent leg stance of someone who is more balanced. If you prefer to put all of your weight on the front, you're going to be a little slower on making your attacks toward me, because of the fact that in order to lean forward and put the majority of your weight on that front leg, your back leg tends to straighten out a bit, and you're not going to have as much potential energy available, which means it doesn't convert to kinetic energy with the same volume that you're going to have of someone who is more evenly distributed. it's difficult to, I understand, probably for a lot of folks out there to understand just from talking about it. But I highly encourage you to experiment with different stances and find out what works best for you. But I have found a perfect balance of my weight is evenly distributed between both legs. I've got a bend in both knees that is the same. That way I've got the same amount of kinetic energy, or sorry, potential energy available in both. And when I see that momentary opening in my opponent, I'm able to attack it now, as opposed to the ramp up, that I call it, of somebody who is not so evenly distributed in one direction or the other. So yes, I do have a great deal of that which I agree with, the knowledge I do agree with, and knowledge that I do not. To include, I mean, even the way certain styles produce defenses, right? I'm very much, if you're a sword and if you're fencing single sword, you got your sword out there, that is should be anyway, your primary means of offense and defense. And your hand is a secondary means of defending yourself. But that doesn't do you a whole lot of good when your hand is held back towards your head. That means, from a fencing perspective, my opponent's sword is going to get pretty much this far before I can even start to interfere with it. So the closer you hold it to you, the less effective it's going to be as a means of defense. You need it to be out in front of you, because this is where all sword fighting happens. It's out front. That's where your sword needs to be. It's where also your, defensive hand should be. So that's another aspect that I do disagree with in some styles. That is, if I was teaching that student, I would be advising them to change some things in order to make them a better balanced fencer overall.
So again, for people who don't necessarily know this, who are watching this video, there are certain rapier styles which sort of stick your butt out and have the body very leaned forward. That's quite common in certain Italian systems, isn't it? And then there are, if we go a little bit later, if we go to certain small sword systems that are related, they often have the weight on the back foot and very light on the front foot. And from my perspective, so your stance is actually entirely normal and familiar to me, because I'm a 19th century saber fencer. So your stance and your way of lunging looks exactly kind of correct from 19th century saber perspective.
Well, how very astute of you. Yes.
Well, and for and from a 19th century perspective as well, that is the correct way to do it. So they had a view that kind of like, oh, well, these guys were still figuring out the lunge, with the knee in front of the ankle very often, or sometimes with the back foot rolled, which you talk about in your book. And this type of thing, different angles of the feet. You have quite a right angle stance, which again is typical in 19th century, but then we see this kind of splayed feet, crow's feet stance, some people refer to it as, in some of the 16th century stuff. And so how do you view, or how do you kind of rationalize some of the stances and even methods of lunging that we see in the 16th and 17th century systems?
So I view it from the standpoint of watching an evolution, right? So all of these different fencing styles exist because of someone somewhere had come up with it and had codified it and put it down in the written word, and we're teaching it, as the case may be in so many instances. And then, of course, somebody else will come along and they will see this particular style. They'll notice that there are some strengths and weaknesses to it. And then, of course, they would add their flavor to it and change it. If you look at any of the period masters that we know today, right? I mean, why do we know their names today, right? Did they just pop out of their mother's womb and they just had all of this knowledge and they just throw it down on a book? No, of course not. They learned what was available to them at the time, and they learned as much as they could, and then they started changing things. And that's why their names, we know them today, because they changed some things in order to come up with the styles that they have today. And in other words, they changed it in order to best suit their strengths, their weaknesses, their knowledge, and their common sense about how to apply swordplay. And I have no doubt that the different styles that we see out there are because somebody comes along eventually and they see things and they change it because they notice that this is a little bit better than that, or if I do this, it speeds up this particular technique, or it gives me greater leverage over my opponent, whatever the case may be. I think that is where we get all of these different styles of fence from. And I have no doubt, I mean, if, let's say, I don't know, let's say Fabris, for example, if he lived twice as long, right? Would he not have learned twice as much? And would everything about fencing he knows that we know of what he knew of fencing from his works, would that not have changed somewhat because of the fact that he was now, you know, twice as knowledgeable as he was about it? I mean, that's the great thing about all of us, is we have all of their works that we can benefit from their knowledge, right? I mean, Sir Isaac Newton said it best, you know, if I have seen farther than others, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants, right? So I think that is our great benefit. And I think it would be a horrible disservice if we stopped with just what they wrote down. I think we need to actually expand that knowledge. I mean, I know, as some people have described it to me as being arrogant for even thinking that we could do that, but I do believe that what they knew of sword fighting and just fencing is not the end all be all of fencing. There is more to learn. I mean, I do think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't try to expand that knowledge and take it even further than the people who came before us did.
Very interesting answer, and a very, you know, full answer. I think it's a really complicated topic.
It is.
Trying to train for competition in the modern world, knowing everything we know, but at the same time, certainly, you know, not everybody, but some people are trying to adhere to a system which was codified and set down in a specific date, and they didn't know everything that came after that. So it's always, you know, there's always a push-pull in HEMA between just recreating and, I suppose you could say, creating, and they're not, you know, they'll sometimes pull in opposite directions.
Yeah, and I definitely empathize with all of them. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with those who want to learn a specific style and they want to become the best they possibly can in that specific style. Just so long, the only time I ever have an issue with anybody is when they believe that theirs is the end all be all, and because you do something a little differently, then comes, you know, oh no, it's, you know, you're not, you know, historical, or you're not, yes, because I invented the parry. Yes, that's I'm not historical. Oh yes, I invented the thrust. No, of course not. I'm just doing things a little differently because I find and I can see how, at least for myself, how things can be improved and made better.
And sometimes there's more than one way to skin a cat, and even if we're
there very much is,
yeah,
absolutely.
And it's even in modern Olympic fencing, there's not only one school of, you know, there's many different varying systems and schools and lineages.
Yeah.
So Rob, the next question is quite pertinent to myself, but I imagine a lot of other people out there as well. Unfortunately, lots of us continue to age, and I know that. So you, if I remember correctly, how old were you when you won Swordfish Rapier?
At Swordfish, that was what, 2019? So that would have been, 49. I think that was what it was.
Wow. Which, honestly, I mean, I think for any sport like fencing, that is a great accomplishment. So clearly, well, I mean, it's, you know, winning Swordfish at anything is a great accomplishment, but I think doing it over the age of 40 is an amazing accomplishment. So clearly, you've kept yourself in tip-top shape. What is your advice to those of us who are fencing over the age of 40?
My best advice for that is just stop aging. Just don't do it. I just refuse to do that, you know. But barring that, if that's not an option. So when I first entered the military, my first boss was a retired lieutenant colonel who, and he had this saying, and that was that stupid is cumulative. And what he meant by that was that all of the dumb things, the way we abuse our bodies when we're young, and, you know, when we're still made of, you know, piano wire and rubber bands, that he says your body remembers. And when you get older, it is more than happy to remind you of all those dumb things you did as a young person, whether that's, you know, how hard you were on your knees, or whether, you know, all the dumb things that we do when we think we're immortal. Now, it's very important that we always treat our bodies well, but when it comes to fencers and wanting to fence into, you know, into the grave, as far as I'm concerned, I have had a lot of fellow swordsmen when I was, you know, both in my 20s and then in my 30s, and as I'm watching these folks, the way they were fencing was not with sound mechanics. It was not with sound body mechanics. They would everything from, throwing their bodies forward and causing low back issues that ultimately took time, away from them when it comes to how long that they were going to be fencing. Or probably the biggest offender were those when they were abusing their knees. Every time that they're lunging and they're pushing all of that momentum and force, pushing the knee past a proper angle, and then of course all of the amount of energy they're putting into thrusting their bodies back out of the engagement. When we're in our 20s and 30s, yeah, that's not a problem. But unfortunately, every time you do that, you're causing these little micro injuries to your body that when you're young, yes, it's robust enough that you're going to be able to, soldier on. But as we get older, those little injuries stack up, and our bodies then say, hey, by the way, do you remember when you were 25 and you did this? Yeah. And then all of a sudden you've got bad knees. And so many of my friends have had to drop out of sword fighting entirely or radically change the way they fence just in order to be able to continue stepping out onto the field and competing. Mm-hmm. So for myself, I have maintained first and foremost, that balance that I was talking about earlier, that is absolutely essential. When you are lunging, you lunge with a perfect form. And even though if you were just to throw yourself over your knees just a little bit, you'd be able to get that hit on your opponent. Well, don't do it, because it's the toll it's taking on the body is not worth it. If you have to do that, first off, like I said about time, it's going to cost you. Your opponent's probably going to take advantage of it and make you pay for it. But physically speaking, that's wearing away the body slowly, a little at a time, until the next thing you know, you have to stop entirely. So there are supplements that I take in order to bolster my body when it comes to particularly the joints, because your knees are probably the most common thing that I see go out on swordsmen is I see them complaining about bad knees. So if you are fencing with good, proper form, I take it from the guy who's almost 52 years old now, and I'm a better fencer now today than I have been at any other point in my life. So that experience, it would be such a waste if I was not able to exercise that anymore. So I've been very careful to take care of my body. So when I do those lunges, my knee doesn't go past the instep. I make sure that I'm not throwing my weight forward, because that's going to, just strictly speaking from a physical standpoint, it puts stresses on the low back, which none of us older fencers are going to want. There's 101 different things that I see people doing poorly that aggravates into injury as they get older. So if we can not do that, that right there will preserve the body for as long as you possibly can. And I one day want to be that 80-year-old swordsman that nobody wants to go near, because the old man is going to make you pay for it. So it's I'm hoping to get there, and so far so good. So, but yeah, and I've got in my book, I've got a lot of I talk about these common mistakes, and I talk about the things that you can do in order to avoid making them. But also too, I speak to my own experience with different injuries and different things that I've had to deal with, and how I either fixed it or found a way to work around it.
That's sterling advice, and I need to take it more. I'm one of those people, I think, who pushed did stupid things in my youth, which I'm still paying for now, with elbow issues. I'm lucky with my knees so far, but my elbows and sometimes lower back. So yeah, I think I need to start taking some of those supplements that you're.
Hey, I'd be more than happy to turn you on to what I use, and be happy to help you out there. Yeah,
that'd be fantastic. So next question. Where do you plan to take? So you mentioned how you feel like your fencing is at top of your game that it's ever been now, which is fantastic. Yeah. I think that's everyone wants to feel like that. Where do you want to take it next? And I guess that's one part of the question. The other part of the question is, I know that you've got some future plans which are quite quite surprising, shall we say, or impressive and everything else. Tell us a bit about what you've got planned for the future and where you'd like to take your fencing next.
So when it comes to where I'm trying to take my fencing next is going to be, I am an adherent to the perfection in everything that I do with fencing. So that means I want to get to the point where I step out there and I'm just untouchable. Now, that's not the case right now. I am very, very good, and in fencing, I'm very, very difficult to hit. But I'm not impossible to hit. And that's, I make mistakes just like everybody else. But every single day that passes, every single fencing practice I go to, every single tournament that I go to, all of these are laboratories, and I'm constantly experimenting with different things, different techniques, different tactics, strategies. How can I shave time here? Is it effective? I'm constantly experimenting and adding to my knowledge little by little each time. And ultimately, that is my goal, is to, I mean, it sounds crazy, I know, but I want to become perfect. I want to become that absolutely perfect fencer that is nigh untouchable. And I'm still working on it. So it's so that's my goal for myself. But as far as where things are going into the future, so I am building a castle. No kidding. We've purchased 140 acres. That's about, I think that's 56.5 hectares for those who use that system. And I am building a castle out there yes, I will be living in it, and that's going to be where I retire to. But more than that, I am doing so for the purposes of being able to hold tournaments there, to be able to hold training seminars there. This place is going to have lodging that people can come and stay in. And this is going to be a place where people can come to learn longsword, and obviously, of course, rapier. They can learn spear. I'm going to be bringing in experts from all over the world, everywhere that I can find. And I want this to be a place of, no kidding, learning. I want this to be a sword fighter's mecca, right? Where you come to this place and more than just being able to learn that, everything about this is going to be, for all intents and purposes, when you step into this forest, which it's 140 acres of forest land that, when you step in there, as soon as you leave your car behind and you step into this place proper, if you didn't know any better, you would swear you were standing in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so that way we can all study and learn and compete in the atmosphere that gave birth to all of these arts in the first place. So that is what I am doing now. And that's why I am so very busy. And my weekends are not really my own anymore, because we are working to bring this about. The plan is that this should be done in 9 years. And the property, of course, will be open to hosting events and whatnot well before that. But the castle itself will be done in approximately 9 years' time.
Wow. So you're starting next year?
No, it's already begun.
We've already
Are
you starting
started,
building next year, though, or is?
Yeah, the castle itself will be the final thing that is done. But as far as we're clearing the parking areas, we've got an area that's sited for the village that's been cleared. We're still, getting all of the trees and such cut up and logged and gotten out of the way. But I mean, we're going to have the tavern will be there, the inn will be there. We'll have a blacksmithy there. But all of it done in a period fashion and form. Now, don't get me wrong. The castle, when it's done, don't think that we're not going to have electricity in there, because it's very much on the inside. It's very much going to be modern. I'm not going to be, for want of modern convenience there. But from the outside, you are going to be walking around, and it's just going to look like, wow. I mean, I'm standing in the middle of the past.
I have to say, by coincidence, I was in some 15th century houses earlier today, and you definitely want modern toilets. But this is in California, isn't it?
This is in California. It's nestled up against the Sierra Nevadas, and which is also right in the middle of wine country. It's about a 2-hour drive away from South Lake Tahoe. So if you like fishing and hiking or water sports, if you're a big wine aficionado, like I said, it's in the middle of wine country. So yeah, it's ideally situated. It's only about an 1.5-hour drive from the major international airport. So it was very important that the location be perfect. And I have this fascination with perfection. So it's something that it's going to be something else. And we're working very hard and pouring a whole lot of resources into this. Like I said, I want this to be someplace where every swordsman anywhere in the world can come to and truly maximize their experience and learn so much and be able to compete against people from all over the world. And it's a lofty goal, but I have never been one to shy away from a challenge. So
it sounds amazing. What an amazing, goal to have. And I think goals in life are very important, whether we realize them, whether they come to fruition or not. I think having things to aim towards is what keeps us going, isn't it? So
absolutely.
So kind of briefly, and let's try and keep this concise because it could just spiral out of control. You
Can do.
have a brief section in your book talking about your experience fencing against recreational fencers versus sporty fencers versus martial fencers.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your views on that.
Okay, so I have discovered that when I go to different fencing practices, and it doesn't matter whether I'm talking about SCA practice or if I'm talking about a HEMA practice, there's those three types of fencers. So you've got your recreationals who are there because they want to mingle with other people who share their hobby, as it were, and it's a very casual approach to things, which is great. I mean, it's whatever it is that works for people. That's what I'm all for. And then you've got the sportsman. You got the sportsman outlook on fencing, and that is a person who's definitely going to be out there and they're going to be training, but they're really out there. They want to win those medals. They want to be very strongly competitive and be able to put on a good performance when they step out there. And then there is my favorite type of personality out there, that my favorite perspective, and that is of the martial perspective. Now, what that means is that this person is trying to become the best swordsman they can be instead of the best sportsman they can be. This is a person that is training and learning and expanding their knowledge and experience for the purposes of, if I was, no kidding, in a sword fight and my life was on the line, I am best prepared in order to be able to survive this contest, which is different from a sportsman's perspective. Because, you look at Olympic fencing, for example, that is very much a sportsman perspective. There's specific rules you have to follow in order to score points. And if you don't, you're not going to. If you both hit each other, as long as one person followed the rules and the other one didn't, then only one person got the points. But in a realistic perspective, right, if you both hit each other, what actually happened? You died in a very period fashion. A lot of duels ended that way.
Absolutely.
But the martial swordsman, the martial perspective, is the person who's looking and training and studying to be the best swordsman, the person who is a martial artist as opposed to a sportsman's artist, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry. I'll have to edit that out.
I know, I've got you all choked up now.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that, and I've got a bit. Not everybody agrees with. I was going to say not everyone agrees with me. Therefore, probably not everyone agrees with you on this.
I've never run into anybody who disagreed with me. Absolutely not. No, of course not.
And some people will, make the valid argument that clearly the person who does very well in competition is not someone you'd want to fence with sharp swords, because they'll probably be pretty good in any situation. But nevertheless, I have over the years noticed there's a certain type of person who is only thinking about how to win within that rule set, and they will change how they fence within different rule sets because that will increase their success rate within the rule set, and they'll find sneaky little ways around that, loopholes essentially. And even in modern Olympic fencing, which is a game in its own right, and this isn't a criticism, but playing the rules is a thing, to get those sweet points and those medals. And absolutely, for me, the thing which really interests me is the martial arts side of it, is the learning how do we use these things in the most effective way, that
very much so.
would have the highest percentage success rate of keeping me alive, basically.
Well, and I've had the conversations with people who say that you can't fence in a martial perspective in a competitive tournament and expect that you're going to come out on top. But I'm telling you right now, I am living proof that that is not the case. Now, there are certain artificialities that I have to introduce into the way that I fence when I'm competing. Like, for example, the speed, the number of times that I have hit my opponent and then we both stopped and we're expecting the judges to make a call, and not a single judge saw a thing, and we're like, okay, I guess we just keep going. But there are certain artificialities that I have introduced. Like, for example, when I hit my opponents now, I do a very unmartial thing, and that is leave my sword in my opponent for just another second, so that way the judges can actually have time to see it, which of course opens you up for a possibility of an afterblow, because you can't use your sword to defend yourself if you're sticking around, showing the judges that you hit them. So there's some artificialities, yes, but in getting to that point was very, very martial. It's not me playing a game of tag. It's not me trying to hit my opponent first and before they hit me. It is control that opponent's weapon, strike that opponent. And in that moment, when I would normally be leaving, yes, I will then hold it on them. So that way the judges can see, oh, look, Rob hit somebody. You know, it's, it is a little difficult sometimes. And we've got a little ways to go yet when it comes to our judging in these HEMA tournaments. But I also have a plan to hopefully help in that arena as well. But yeah, it's,
and I think
you can fence martially and still win.
Absolutely. And I think you also touched on a point there that you can be a martial fencer, but still modify how you're fencing within a bout or within a tournament. Correct. In order to get the results you want, but you're still able to fence the, you know, in other ways. And so one of the things that I try to instill in my students is flexibility and adaptability, and I've encountered a lot of fencers competitively and just sparring in the club over the years who are very good at what they do, and that will work maybe against 4 out of 5 opponents, but then there's that one opponent they can just never beat because they just do what they do and they're not able to change what they do to deal with that extra person.
And the number of people that are out there that are like that, I have run into just on my own, where they will present something and I will go through and I will hit them, you know, tear that defense apart, and they will do the exact same thing over and over and then do it over again without changing. It is absolutely amazing to me that that is so ingrained that you cannot change and go outside of that that little circle of knowledge that you've applied. It's it still kind of amazes me to this day when I run into that.
And the problem is that a person who is sort of very fixed in one way of fencing, you know, it's like rock paper scissors. Is that you know, yes, you might be the rock and you might always beat the scissors, but the paper will always beat you. And so if you're always just the rock or you're just the scissors, you're always going to get beaten by that type of opponent.
Correct.
And yeah, so you know, I wouldn't consider myself the greatest fencer around, but I've certainly got some very good fencers in my club. And you know, I might find one person I can easily beat, despite the fact that they easily beat someone who I find real trouble to fence.
Yeah, it's akin to the lover's triangle kind of thing, where you get the fencer's triangle, right? I know. Trust me, I'm very well aware of that. And I've coached many a student through how to open up that mindset. When something else is clearly not working, then it's time to change. Yeah. I mean, a classic example of that was the very tournament that you had mentioned with Swordfish, when it came down to Dimitri and I. Right. Okay. During that second bout, he did a lot of the same thing over and over again, and it wasn't working. And then, to his credit, during our third bout, he changed it. He actually, you know, he turned that off and then started coming at it from a different perspective, which was absolutely the thing he should have done. Because, you know, it's adaptability, it's flexibility, it's what every fencer should have as a staple in their repertoire of abilities.
Okay, so that's been absolutely fantastic. There are 100 more questions that I could throw at you and we could talk about for ages. Maybe if there's an appetite for it, if the viewers of this have specific questions they'd like me to ask you, or specific things they'd like us to talk about in the future, maybe that's something we could come back and look at. But for now, I want to tell the viewers of this to check out. I'm going to put a link below to your book. It's a fantastic resource. People should go and check it out. I think that, like I say, I think experienced HEMA fencers or people who are completely new to fencing of any kind, whether they're doing Olympic fencing, whether they're doing rapier, whether they're doing saber. I have to say, as a saber fencer, there's tons of stuff in there that I think super useful and very compatible with saber. So yeah, super useful book. Go and check it out. Thank you, Rob, for coming on here and having a big old chat. I think we've actually covered some really interesting and almost deep topics there.
Thanks much. Yeah, and absolutely. If anybody's got questions, by all means, I'm more than happy to do another one of these. Or if they just have simple questions about the book, by all means, feel free to reach out. I am not hard to get a hold of.
And I presume, you know, you're in California, so anyone who wants to come and train with you and search you out, I'll stick a link below in the description to this video.
I've had students who came all the way from China. So, yeah. I mean, by all means, I got an extra bedroom. We can help you out.
Awesome stuff. Brilliant. Okay, Rob, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. And I'm going to go back and read more of the book more deeply, because I've only had it for a few days, so I haven't had a lot of time to go deeply into it. But there's a lot of stuff that I want to piqued my interest a lot, and I want to go back and read it more carefully and think about it. So thanks a lot for sharing that
Sure
with
enough.
me. And hopefully we'll get to meet one day in the flesh, because I've heard your name mentioned in awe and respect for a few years now, and but we've never had the chance to meet yet. So it's very nice.
Well, I look forward to when we get to do that. And yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to meet you and get to know you a little bit on this, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you, Rob. Cheers a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.